Welcome to the debate. Today, we are dissecting a dilemma that sits right at the intersection of psychology and strategy for every Web3 founder. It is the choice between, well, deep work, actually building your product, and high visibility networking, attending the massive city takeover conferences like Token 2049, Consensus, or Solana Breakpoint.
Right. It is the classic code or cocktail dilemma. I mean, the material we are analyzing today, how to choose Web3 events, a founder-to-founder framework, it really forces us to ask a brutal question. Are these expensive, exhausting global events a critical marketing signal? Or are they just expensive distractions creating this illusion of progress?
Exactly. And I am going to argue that in the Web3 economy, which is fundamentally an attention economy, these hype-driven events are not optional. They are a survival mechanism. In a nascent industry, visibility actually is legitimacy. If you aren't seen, you just don't exist to the capital markets.
Well, I take the opposing view. For early-stage teams, relevance beats reach every single time. The material makes it clear that lost development time is a fatal cost. I am going to argue that the hype circuit is a negative ROI activity for pre-product market fit founders, and that most people attending these are just confusing motion with actual business progress.
We definitely have a fundamental disagreement on how value is captured in this industry. Let's get right into it.
Let's do it.
I want to start by challenging the premise that hype is a dirty word. The source material warns against chasing hype, sure, but it also explicitly states that large conferences like Token 2049 make sense when your primary goal is fundraising, partnerships, or visibility. Look at the mechanics of our industry. Web3 is trustless by design. We rely on code, smart contracts, cryptographic verification, not middlemen. Yet, paradoxically, because the tech is so new, volatile, and frankly full of scams, human trust is the currency that actually moves the needle. You cannot automate a handshake. The text notes that the right events can compress months of learning into a few days. That is the key insight here. Compression.
Compression of what, though?
Compression of the trust-building cycle. I mean, if I am an early-stage founder, I can stay in my basement and write the most elegant zero-knowledge proof circuit in the world. But if I don't signal to the market, to the VCs, to the exchanges, the integration partners, that I am real, funded, and present, I have zero leverage. Attending the big stage event isn't vanity. It is a signaling mechanism. It tells the ecosystem, I am here, and I have the resources to be part of the conversation. If you skip the big show, you are invisible to the capital you need to scale.
I think you are conflating signaling with substance. Let's look at the concept of opportunity cost, which the material highlights heavily. It quotes a founder saying, "If I spend a week at an event, something else does not get built." For an early-stage startup, your only real leverage is your shipping velocity. The market does not care if you're present, if your protocol gets hacked, or your UI is unusable because you're busy drinking warm white wine in a hotel lobby in Singapore.
But relationships are part of the business infrastructure. You can't separate them.
Not if the product doesn't work. The material describes founders who spent months traveling, hitting every major city, Dubai, Denver, Singapore. And 6 months later, their product hadn't meaningfully changed. They felt busy, they were exhausted, but they were completely stagnant. That is the illusion of progress. If you are at a conference hoping to signal legitimacy, but your GitHub repo, your actual code base, is dead, that signal is a lie. The market will find out eventually.
Okay, that's a worst-case scenario. I'm talking about competent founders who can chew gum and walk at the same time. The material mentions that the right events put you inside an ecosystem instead of watching it from the outside. This is crucial. You can't build in a vacuum. Being inside means understanding the meta-narratives, hearing the whisper networks about what is actually getting funded, and finding the partners who will distribute your tech. If you ignore the hype events, you might build a great product that solves a problem nobody cares about anymore. The hype is the market talking to you.
Or it is the market talking to itself in an echo chamber. You call it market feedback. I call it a distraction. The source explicitly advises that early stage teams should prioritize access over scale. You don't need 10,000 people at a hype event, you need 5 right people. And you usually don't find those 5 people on a loud expo floor surrounded by crypto influencers and swag booths.
That leads us perfectly to the second point, which is serendipity versus strategy. You seem to view the chaos of a major conference as a bug. I see it as a feature.
It is a bug if it drains your runway and your sanity.
Not if you use it correctly. The source material counters the idea that conferences are just lottery tickets. It notes that founders who benefited from large conferences treated them like calendars full of pre-booked meetings. They didn't wander aimlessly. They used the density of the event to their advantage. Where else can you find every major exchange listing manager, every major VC partner, and every infrastructure provider in a 3-mile radius?
Yeah, but look at the quality of that density. The framework in the text says, ignore the headline numbers, ask who actually shows up. It draws a sharp contrast between audiences. Token 2049 attracts funds, exchanges, and marketers. ETH Global or DevConnect attracts builders. If you are early stage, your biggest risk is building the wrong thing. You need feedback from other developers, not a pitch meeting with a VC who won't invest until you have traction anyway. The text warns that if your product targets developers, an event list of traders will not help you. That isn't serendipity. That is bad targeted.
I disagree with that filtering, honestly. Even a technical founder needs capital. Even a technical founder needs distribution. You might meet a developer at a hackathon, but you meet the person who signs the partnership check at Consensus. The material mentions that founders who attended carefully chosen events came back with real partnerships. Those deals don't happen in the coding trenches. They happen in the lobbies of the major hotels during the hype week. Serendipity is just preparedness meeting opportunity.
I am sorry, but I just don't buy that efficiency argument. The signal-to-noise ratio at those massive events is terrible. You spend 90% of your time filtering out noise. The source material highlights a much better alternative for the early stage, which is hackathons. It mentions ETH Global and BNB Hack specifically. It says these events pull builders, mentors, sponsors, and ecosystem teams into the same place for a short, intense stretch of time.
Hackathons are great for building. I don't deny that. But they are a completely different game.
It is not just that they are good for building. They offer tangible ROI, return on investment. The text lists the specific outcomes: finding co-founders, winning non-dilutive funding through bounties, that is cash prizes that don't cost you equity, and getting direct feedback from protocol teams. The source says founders told them their project only became real once a hackathon forced them to focus. Compare that to walking around an expo floor collecting business cards. At a hackathon, you are shipping code. At a hype conference, you are talking about shipping code. For an early-stage team, that distinction is everything.
That is a compelling distinction, but I would frame it differently. Hackathons build product. Large conferences build companies. You cannot scale a startup on bounties alone. Eventually, you need to step up to the big leagues. The source material lists fundraising as a valid primary goal. You generally cannot fundraise effectively at a hackathon where everyone is heads down coding and the VCs aren't even wearing badges. You fundraise at the events where the check writers are signaling their own relevance. If you want to raise a seed round, you go where the money is, and the money is at the hype events.
Is it, though? Where is the money at the ecosystem-specific events? The source mentioned Solana Breakpoint or NearCon. It says these events gather builders and foundations around one chain. The conversations are focused, and decision-makers are present. This seems like the middle ground that invalidates the need for the massive generalist hype festivals. Why go to a generic crypto conference when you can go to a high-signal ecosystem event where everyone already speaks your language?
I agree. Those are valuable. But even there, the principle remains. You are going for the visibility. You are going to be seen by the core contributors and foundation teams. That is still a signaling game. My point is that the marketing signal of being present is non-negotiable. If you stay home to focus, you miss the ecosystem alignment. You can't code your way into a network. And let's be honest, the hype events act as a filtering mechanism for the ecosystem itself. If a protocol or a startup can't afford to show up, the market unconsciously categorizes them as Tier 2. It is harsh, but it's true.
That is a dangerous mindset. That is exactly what leads to the illusion of progress the source warns about. The text has a very specific warning about the Twitter or X signal. It says, "For a long time, we believed the usual signals. If everyone was talking about an event on Twitter, it had to be worth attending. That assumption cost me time, money, and focus."
That is a fair warning about blindly following the herd. FOMO is a dangerous drug.
It is more than just FOMO. It is about vanity metrics. The marketing signal you value so highly is often just noise. If you go to a conference to post a selfie and say, "Great energy at token 2049, but you don't have a product that works, you are signaling incompetence, not legitimacy. You are signaling that you prioritize optics over engineering. The source advises, if you cannot articulate your goal in one sentence, skip the event. Most early-stage founders go to these hype events with a vague goal of networking. That is a death sentence for productivity.
I am not arguing for aimless wandering. I am arguing for strategic presence. The source notes that successful founders treated events as long-term investments. They built trust over time. Being seen repeatedly at the major circuit events signals staying power to the market. It shows you aren't a fly-by-night operation. If you skip this year, people wonder if you're dead. In regarding the lost product development time, I would argue that is an acceptable loss if the founder returns with clarity or momentum, which the source admits happens with carefully chosen attendance.
Clarity usually comes from honest conversations, and the source makes an interesting observation about where those happen. It notes that side events often hold more value than the main ticket. It mentions ETH Denver specifically, where the surrounding week is filled with smaller, focused gatherings. This implies the hype event itself, the main stage, the expo hall, is just a wrapper. The value is on the periphery. So why pay thousands of dollars for the main ticket? Why not just hack the system and do the side events?
Because without the main event, the periphery doesn't exist. You can't have a side event without a main event to anchor it. And if you are an early stage founder, you need the badge. You need the access. You need to be able to walk into the venue. The source says the wrong events create the illusion of progress, but the right ones lead to compounding relationships. You don't get compounding relationships by staying in your office. You get them by showing up year after year, even when it is expensive, even when it is exhausting. That is how you weave yourself into the fabric of the industry.
I think you are underestimating the founder-to-founder framework the source proposes. It is a filtration system. It says if an event fails at least 2 of these steps, we skip it. The steps are things like check audience alignment and assess opportunity cost. My read of the material is that for 90% of early-stage founders, the massive hype conferences fail these tests. The audience is too broad, traders versus builders, and the opportunity cost of not shipping is just too high.
And my read is that for the founders who actually want to build a venture-scale business, the hype conferences are the only place to pass the engagement signals test. The source mentions looking for ecosystem or protocol-backed sponsorships. Where do you find those in the highest concentration? The major conferences.
But the advice concludes with a warning. Web3 events can either move you forward or pull you off track, and the default state of a hype event is distraction. The lights, the parties, the noise, it is designed to distract.
It is designed to attract attention. Attention is the scarcest resource in the economy.
But attention without product is a bubble.
And product without attention is a hobby.
Touché. But let's look at the mistakes founders warned us about section. It lists chasing hype instead of relevance as number 1. That is verbatim. How can you argue for hype-driven conferences when the source explicitly lists chasing hype as a mistake?
Because there's a nuance between chasing hype and leveraging hype. Chasing hype is going because everyone else is going with no plan. Leveraging hype is going because that is where the liquidity and the partnerships are. and you have a scheduled calendar to extract that value. The source says the difference is rarely the event itself, but how and why you decide to be there. I am arguing that if you decide to be there to signal legitimacy and secure the future of your company through fundraising, the hype event is not just necessary, it is efficient.
Efficient? I struggle with that word. The source describes founders who attended 1 or 2 events a year and came back with clarity. That suggests a strategy of extreme selectivity, not a strategy of presence of survival. If you are everywhere, you are nowhere. I maintain that the marketing signal is weak compared to the shipping signal. If you ship consistently, people will come to you. You don't need to fly to Singapore to prove you are real.
In a perfect world, meritocracy would be absolute. But in Web3, narratives drive markets. The source admits that the right event can compress months of learning. That compression is worth the ticket price. It is worth the week of lost coding. Because if you learn in 3 days that your entire premise is wrong because you talked to 10 other founders at a side event in Dubai, you just saved yourself 6 months of building the wrong thing. That isn't a distraction. That is the highest ROI activity a founder can do.
But you can get that learning at a developer conference like DevConnect, which the source describes a temporary city for builders. You don't need the laser shows and the shilling of a token 2049 to get that insight. In fact, the glitz might obscure the truth. The source says DevConnect is for serious learning. That implies the other stuff maybe isn't so serious.
Serious doesn't always mean somber. Business is done at the party. That is just human nature, and it is definitely Web3 nature. We can't pretend that the social layer doesn't dictate the technical layer. The source highlights that human connection is what accelerates deals, and frankly, the parties, the dinners, the hype, that is where the human connection happens. You bond over the chaos.
I think we're reaching an impasse on the culture. But let's look at the logistics. The material talks about preparation as the antidote to waste. It suggests setting up meetings weeks in advance. If you are an early-stage founder, do you even have the pull to set up meetings weeks in advance with anyone important?
That is exactly why you go to force those meetings to hustle. If you can't hustle a meeting at a conference, how are you going to hustle a client? The conference is a testing ground for your ability to do business.
Or it is a place where you get ghosted because everyone is too busy looking for someone more important. The source warns about calendar fatigue, but let's pivot to the ecosystem alignment point again. The text mentions that some events are better for specific stages. It suggests that if you are pre-product, you should be at hackathons. If you are scaling, you go to the big shows. My argument is that too many pre-product founders are trying to play the scaling game.
I would argue that the lines are blurrier than that. You don't wait until you are scaling to build the relationships for scale. You plant the seeds early. The source mentions that successful founders view these events as long-term relationship building. You might meet a VC at Token 2049 when you are pre-product and they won't invest, but they remember you. 6 months later, when you have the product, that relationship is already warm. You paid the time tax early to get the speed later. That is a definition of a strategic investment.
That sounds like a very expensive lottery ticket. You are betting thousands of dollars on the memory of a VC who met 500 people that week. I prefer the deterministic ROI of a hackathon bounty. I put in code, I get out money and reputation. It is linear, it is safe.
Safe doesn't build unicorns. Safe keeps you small. The hype events are high risk, high reward. And that fits the venture model perfectly.
I think we have drilled down to the bedrock here. It is time to wrap this up.
I agree.
From my perspective, the takeaway from this material is clear. Networking is vital. But for an early-stage founder, the default answer to a big hype event should be no. The risks of drained focus, the physical cost of travel, and the fatal cost of not shipping are just too high. The source advises us to filter by format, look for builders, and not let Twitter FOMO dictate strategy. If you can't articulate your goal in one sentence, and if that goal isn't actively facilitated by the specific audience in the room, Stay home and build.
And I maintain that while mindless travel is destructive, strategic presence at these hype events is non-negotiable for serious ventures. The marketing signal is real because it proves you are a persistent part of the ecosystem's fabric. The source material validates that fundraising and partnerships are legitimate goals for these large venues. If you prepare, if you book the meetings and define the goal, the ROI of one major partnership outweighs a week of lost coding. You cannot build a billion-dollar protocol in isolation. You have to go where the people are.
I think we can both agree on the source's founder-to-founder framework as the ultimate arbiter. Define one goal.
Absolutely. If that goal is building, go to the hackathon. But if that goal is visibility or capitalization, don't be afraid of the big show.
The error is not in going, but in going without a purpose.
Well said. We invite you to look at your own calendar for the year ahead. Are you chasing hype, or are you leveraging it?
And are you confusing motion with progress?
That is it for the debate. We will see you next time.